What happens when the galaxy's most feared warrior race discovers that humans don't just fight for territory, resources, or glory, but for something far more dangerous? Love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that every life has worth. In a universe where political marriages seal alliances and unwanted princesses are discarded like broken tools, one human soldier is about to prove why Earth's children are the most terrifying force the cosmos has ever encountered. Not because of their weapons, their tactics, or their technology, but because they possess something that even the mightiest empires have forgotten: the absolute refusal to abandon those who matter to them. The Zephyrian Empire thought they were getting a disposable soldier when they recruited Marcus Chen. They had no idea they were about to learn why humans have a saying, touch our family, and find out why we conquered our own planet before we reached for the stars. The recruitment center on Proxima Station reeked of desperation and disinfectant. Marcus Chen stood in line with 200 other humans, each one clutching their application forms like lifelines. The Zephyrian Empire had opened their military to alien species for the first time in 3 centuries, and humanity had jumped at the chance with typical enthusiasm. Next, the Zephyrian processing officer's forearms moved with mechanical precision, stamping rejection after rejection. His purple carapace gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his compound eyes barely registered the humans as individuals. They were just meat to be sorted. Marcus stepped forward, his worn combat boots clicking against the metal floor. 6 years of service in the Terran Defense Corps had taught him how to stand at attention, but it hadn't prepared him for the dismissive snort from Officer Crixtal. "Another human ground pounder," Crixtal muttered, scanning Marcus's file with one eye while 3 others tracked movement around the room. "Limited space combat experience, no noble lineage, no special skills. Why should the Empire waste resources training you?" "Because I follow orders and I don't quit," Marcus replied simply. He'd learned long ago that fancy words didn't win wars, commitment did. Crixtal's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Orders? Human, in the Empire, orders come from those who matter. Nobility. Bloodlines that stretch back millennia. What bloodline do you claim?" "The one that fought for every inch of ground from the caves to the stars." Something in Marcus's tone made the Zephyrian look up with all 4 eyes. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the hum of the air recyclers. Then, Crixtal stamped the application with unnecessary force. "Accepted. Report to Transport Bay 7. You'll be assigned to the 47th Expedition Fleet under Admiral Vexar. Try not to disgrace your species immediately." The transport to the Imperial Fleet was a converted cargo hauler that had seen better decades. Marcus found himself crammed into a compartment with 50 other new recruits, mostly humans, but also a few desperate Altarians and a lone vegan trader who'd apparently burned bridges in several systems. "First time in Imperial service?" The question came from a compact woman with lieutenant's stripes on her collar. Her name tag read Chen, no relation, just another common surname that had survived Earth's chaotic history. "First time off-world for military service," Marcus admitted. "You?" "Third tour. Started as enlisted, worked my way up. Fair warning, the Zephyrians don't see aliens as equals. We're tools. Useful sometimes, but expendable always." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "The smart ones keep their heads down and hope for easy assignments. The rest end up as cannon fodder in border conflicts." The transport docked with Admiral Vexar's flagship 3 days later. The Decimator was a massive dreadnought, 5 kilometers of armored hull bristling with weapons that could crack planets. As Marcus walked through the corridors, he passed Zephyrian crew members who towered over him, their chitinous armor gleaming and their movements precise. The briefing room contained 200 new arrivals and one very unhappy admiral. Vexar was old by Zephyrian standards, his carapace scarred and his lower arms ending in mechanical prosthetics. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd destroyed star systems. "Welcome to the 47th Expedition Fleet. Some of you may survive long enough to see home again. Most will not." His compound eyes swept the assembled recruits. "You are here because the Empire requires expendable assets for our current mission. We are bound for the Zirian system, where rebels have declared independence from Imperial rule." A holographic display materialized above the Admiral's head, showing a star map dotted with red indicators. The Xerian rebels possess significant military assets, including captured Imperial technology. Previous expeditions have failed to pacify the system. You will succeed where others have not, because failure is not acceptable. Marcus studied the tactical display with professional interest. The rebel positions were well-chosen asteroid fields for cover, multiple fallback positions, and supply lines that would be difficult to interdict. It looked like a meat grinder waiting to happen. Your primary mission is to serve as assault troops for planetary invasions. Your secondary mission is to die usefully if primary mission success appears unlikely. Vexar's mandibles clicked with dark humor. Questions? A vegan in the back row raised a tentacle. Admiral, what support can we expect for these operations? You will receive standard Imperial equipment and rations. Medical support will be provided as resources permit. Next question. Marcus found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to. What about extraction protocols for wounded personnel? The room fell silent. Admiral Vexar fixed all four eyes on Marcus, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Soldier, what is your name and species? Sergeant Marcus Chen, human, sir. Sergeant Chen, wounded personnel who cannot continue fighting are a burden on military operations. Imperial doctrine is clear: resources are allocated to those who can contribute to victory. Extraction protocols exist for valuable personnel only. The Admiral's prosthetic arm whirred as he gestured dismissively. Are there any intelligent questions? The briefing continued for another hour, covering supply chains, communication protocols, and rules of engagement. As they filed out, the vegan who'd asked about support tentacles brushed against Marcus's arm. That was foolish, human. The Admiral will remember your face now. Good, Marcus replied quietly. Maybe he'll remember that some species value their people. Living quarters aboard the Decimator were divided by species and rank. Humans occupied Deck 47, in compartments originally designed for cargo storage. The sleeping berths were barely long enough for average human height, and the communal areas were furnished with equipment sized for Zephyrian anatomy. Marcus's bunkmate was a former colonial marine named Rodriguez who'd signed up after his homeworld's economy collapsed. Third day aboard and I already missed the core, Rodriguez said, struggling to fit his gear into an undersized locker. At least there we were fighting for something that mattered. What makes you think this doesn't matter? Marcus asked, unpacking his kit with practiced efficiency. Come on, Chen. We're hired guns for an empire that sees us as walking ammunition. The moment we're not useful, they'll dump us at the nearest station and recruit fresh meat. Rodriguez's bitter laugh echoed in the cramped space. The only thing that matters to the Zephyrians is power. Everything else is expendable. That night, Marcus lay on his narrow bunk and listened to the ship's sounds, the hum of engines, the whisper of air recyclers, the distant clang of machinery. Through the hull, he could see stars wheeling past as the fleet moved toward its destination. Somewhere out there, people were preparing to fight and die for causes they believed in. The thought that had been nagging at him since the briefing finally crystallized. This wasn't just about military service or even survival. The Zephyrian Empire represented everything humanity had fought against during its own dark periods, the belief that some lives mattered more than others, that power justified any action, that loyalty flowed only upward. If he was going to serve in this fleet, Marcus decided, he would serve on his own terms. The Empire might see humans as expendable tools, but he would show them what those tools were actually capable of when they had something worth fighting for. The ship's intercom crackled to life, announcing shift changes and duty assignments. Tomorrow would bring new briefings, training exercises, and preparations for combat. But tonight, floating between the stars in a ship full of predators, Sergeant Marcus Chen made a promise to himself. He would survive this deployment. More importantly, he would make sure his fellow humans survived it too. And, if the Zephyrian Empire didn't like his methods, they could learn what Earth's children were really capable of when someone threatened their family. The stars continued their eternal dance outside the viewport, indifferent to the struggles of mortals. But, among those mortals, something had changed. A human soldier had decided that some things were more important than orders, and the galaxy was about to learn why that made humanity the most dangerous species it had ever encountered. The fleet jumped to hyperspace with a sound like thunder, carrying Marcus Chen toward a destiny none of them could imagine. The Zirian system materialized around the fleet like a vision from hell. 3 gas giants orbited a dying star, their surfaces racked by storms that had raged for millennia. Scattered between them, a dozen rocky worlds hosted rebel strongholds that bristled with defensive installations. Marcus stood in the observation deck with his squad, watching as Admiral Vexhar's tactical display updated with each probe sweep. The rebels had been busy during the months since the last Imperial expedition, new fortifications, expanded shipyards, and what looked like a massive fleet of converted freighters turned into weapons platforms. Estimates put rebel strength at 12,000 ground troops across 6 worlds, Lieutenant Torres briefed the assault teams. Intelligence indicates they're using captured Imperial equipment, so expect them to know our tactics. What about civilian populations? Marcus asked, studying the planetary scans. Torres glanced at the Zephyrian observers before answering carefully. Imperial policy classifies all residents of rebel worlds as enemy combatants. Rules of engagement are flexible. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, klaxons began wailing throughout the ship. The deck shuddered as massive engines fired, adjusting their course toward the system's 4th planet. Admiral Vexhar's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. All personnel, prepare for immediate deployment. Long-range scans have detected a priority target on Zirian 4. We will secure this target before proceeding with standard pacification protocols. The priority target turned out to be a single structure on the planet's northern continent, a crystalline palace that emerged from mountain peaks like something from a fever dream. As the assault shuttles descended through atmosphere thick with metallic particles, Marcus could see that the palace was both beautiful and heavily defended. What's so important about one building? Rodriguez muttered, checking his pulse rifle for the 3rd time. Their Zephyrian squad leader, Sergeant Klix, turned 2 eyes toward the humans while keeping the others focused on his tactical display. Intelligence indicates the structure houses rebel leadership. Capture or elimination of high-value targets will significantly degrade enemy capability. The lie was obvious to anyone who'd spent time studying Imperial behavior. Marcus had seen enough classified briefings during his transport corps days to recognize a political operation when he saw one. This wasn't about rebel leaders, this was about someone the Empire wanted to get their claws on. The shuttle touched down in a clearing 2 kilometers from the palace. As the assault teams deployed, Marcus got his first good look at Zirian IV's landscape. The world was dying, poisoned atmosphere, withered vegetation, and a sun that cast everything in sickly orange light. Whatever had happened here, it was recent enough that the scars were still fresh. Move out, Klix ordered. Standard advance formation. Humans take point. Of course they did. Marcus hefted his rifle and started forward, his boots crunching on ground that felt wrong somehow, too soft, too yielding. Behind him, 40 other humans followed in loose formation while the Zephyrian supervisors stayed back in positions with good fields of fire. The approach to the palace was suspiciously quiet. Marcus had expected defensive positions, automated weapons, or at least some kind of perimeter guards. Instead, they found only empty corridors filled with that same orange light filtering through crystal walls. "This doesn't feel right," whispered Private Jackson, a young soldier who joined up after his homeworld's mines played out. "Where is everybody?" The answer came 20 minutes later when they reached the palace's central chamber. The vast space was circular, with walls that curved up to a domed ceiling decorated with constellations Marcus didn't recognize. At the center stood a single figure in chains. She was humanoid but clearly not human, taller than Marcus by a full head, with skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her hair was silver and moved as if underwater, despite the still air. When she looked up at the approaching soldiers, her eyes were the color of deep space, filled with stars that seemed to swirl and dance. "Princess Lyration," Sergeant Klix announced, consulting his datapad. "Heir to the Zirian Confederation and high-value Imperial asset. Secure for transport." Marcus stopped walking. Around the chamber, he could see evidence of recent violence, scorch marks on the walls, damaged furniture, and what looked like bloodstains on the crystal floor. This wasn't a military target. This was someone who'd been left behind. "Where are her guards?" he asked. Clix's compound eyes fixed on Marcus with obvious irritation. Enemy personnel were eliminated during initial assault. "Your concern for rebel safety is noted, Sergeant Chen." But Marcus was studying the princess more carefully now. Her chains weren't restraints, they were medical devices, monitoring her vital signs and pumping some kind of fluid into her bloodstream. The way she held herself suggested pain, not just physical but emotional. This was someone who'd been abandoned by her own people. "The Confederation leadership evacuated 12 hours ago," Princess Narration said, her voice carrying an accent that made each word sound like music. "They deemed my capture acceptable losses in their strategic withdrawal." Rodriguez stepped closer to Marcus and whispered, "This is bad news, brother. When royalty gets left behind, it usually means they're more valuable as martyrs than as leaders." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd seen enough Imperial interrogations to know what happened to high-value prisoners. They'd be kept alive just long enough to extract useful information, then disposed of when their intelligence value was exhausted. The fact that her own people had abandoned her meant she was already considered dead by both sides. "Medical assessment indicates the subject will survive transport," one of the Zephyrian medics reported after running a scanner over the princess. "However, the life support systems appear to be preventing some form of biological deterioration. Removal from the devices may result in rapid decline." "Acceptable risk," Clix replied. "Prepare her for transport." We return to the fleet immediately. As the team began disconnecting the medical equipment, Princess Narration caught Marcus's eye. There was no plea for help in her gaze, just a kind of weary acceptance that made his chest tight. She knew exactly what was going to happen to her, and she'd already resigned herself to it. That was when Marcus made his second life-changing decision in less than a week. "Sergeant Clix," he said, stepping between the Zephyrian squad leader and the princess. "I volunteer to serve as her personal guard during transport." The silence that followed was deafening. 40 humans and 12 Zephyrians stared at Marcus as if he'd just announced his intention to marry a supernova. Even Princess Narration looked surprised, her starfield eyes widening slightly. "Explain your reasoning, Sergeant Chen," Clix said slowly. Marcus had maybe 10 seconds to come up with a justification that wouldn't get him shot for insubordination. High-value prisoners require constant monitoring. If her medical condition is as fragile as the scan indicates, having a dedicated guard will prevent accidents during transport. It was thin, but it was also logical enough that Clix couldn't reject it without looking incompetent. More importantly, it gave Marcus legal authority to stay close to the princess, authority that would be recognized by Imperial military law. "Very well. You are assigned as prisoner escort for the duration of transport. Any attempt to interfere with interrogation protocols will result in summary execution." Clix's mandibles clicked ominously. "Are we clear, Sergeant?" "Crystal clear, sir." The return journey to the flagship took 6 hours. Marcus spent most of it sitting across from Princess Narration in the shuttle's cargo bay, watching her struggle with withdrawal from whatever medication the life support system had been providing. She was clearly in pain, but she didn't make a sound. "Why?" she asked finally, when they were 2 hours out from the fleet. "Why what? Why volunteer to guard a dead woman? Your people gain nothing from association with me. The Confederation has written me off as a casualty, and the Empire sees me as a temporary asset. There is no benefit to drawing attention to yourself." Marcus considered several answers before settling on the simplest one. "Because nobody else did." Princess Narration studied him for a long moment, her stellar eyes unreadable. "Your species is unusual, Sergeant Chen. Most civilizations understand that loyalty must be earned or bought. You seem to give it freely to strangers." "Not freely," Marcus corrected. "But we don't make people prove they deserve basic dignity." The shuttle docked with the decimator just as Admiral Vexhar was convening his staff for the next phase of operations. Marcus escorted Princess Narration to the detention level, noting how the Zephyrian crew members stepped aside as they passed. Whether from respect or revulsion, he couldn't tell. The detention cell was a cube barely large enough for a human, let alone someone of the princess's height. The walls were bare metal, the lighting was harsh, and the only furniture was a sleeping platform that looked like it had been designed for maximum discomfort. "Home sweet home," Marcus said grimly, helping the princess settle onto the platform. "I'll be stationed outside if you need anything." "Sergeant Chen," she said as he turned to leave. "What happens when your superiors decide you are more trouble than you are worth?" Marcus paused in the doorway. It was a good question, one he'd been avoiding thinking about since he'd volunteered for this assignment. By Imperial standards, he was already walking a very thin line between duty and insubordination. "I guess we'll find out," he said finally. "But, Princess, I want you to understand something. Where I come from, when somebody's been left behind, that's when we try hardest to bring them home. Even if home isn't what it used to be." The cell door sealed with a sound like judgment, leaving Princess Lyrishan alone with her thoughts and Marcus alone with his rapidly mounting conviction that he'd just committed himself to something that would either save them both or get them both killed. Outside in the corridor, he could hear Admiral Vexhar's voice echoing from the command deck, issuing orders for the next assault. Soon the fleet would move on to other targets, other battles, other casualties in the Empire's endless hunger for dominance. But, for now, in a cell deep in the ship's bowels, a human soldier stood guard over an abandoned princess, and both of them wondered if choosing to care about someone was the bravest thing they'd ever done, or the stupidest. The answer, Marcus suspected, would depend entirely on what they were willing to sacrifice to find out. 3 days into the journey to the next target system, Marcus learned that guarding a princess was more complicated than he'd expected. It wasn't the physical demands, standing watch outside a detention cell was easier than most military duties. The challenge was watching someone slowly fade away and being powerless to stop it. Princess Lyrishan was dying. Without the life support systems from her palace, her body was beginning to shut down in ways that human medicine couldn't address. Her skin had taken on a grayish tinge, her stellar eyes were dimming, and she spent most of her time in what appeared to be a meditative trance. "The Zirian royal bloodline carries a genetic modification," she explained during one of their conversations. "It was designed to enhance our connection to the crystalline matrices that power our technology. However, it requires constant biochemical regulation to prevent cellular breakdown." Marcus leaned against the cell door, trying to keep his voice casual. "How long do you have?" "Perhaps 2 weeks without proper treatment. Less if the interrogations are vigorous." And that was the other problem. Admiral Vexhar's intelligence staff had scheduled their first session with the princess for tomorrow morning. Marcus had seen Imperial interrogation reports during his time in the Transport Corps. They weren't known for their restraint when it came to extracting information from enemy prisoners. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Some kind of medical treatment, a way to synthesize what you need." Princess Lyrishan smiled sadly. "Sergeant Chen, I appreciate your concern, but the biochemical compounds required are produced by organisms native to the Zirian system. Even if you could obtain them, the Empire would never waste resources keeping a rebel prisoner alive longer than necessary." That evening, Marcus found himself in the human quarters common area, staring at a cup of synthetic coffee and trying to figure out his next move. Around him, other off-duty soldiers played cards, shared stories from home, or simply tried to decompress from another day of serving in an alien military. "You look like a man with problems," Rodriguez said, settling into the chair across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Marcus glanced around the room, noting which conversations were loud enough to mask their words. "Hypothetically, what would you do if you knew someone was going to die and you might be able to prevent it?" "Hypothetically? Depends on who we're talking about and what preventing it would cost." Rodriguez kept his voice low. "We talking about the princess?" "Maybe." "Chen, brother, you need to be very careful here. I've been asking around, and the word is that Admiral Vexhar is already unhappy about your volunteer assignment. You start making waves about prisoner treatment, and you'll find yourself in the cell next to her." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. What he hadn't expected was how much that possibility bothered him. Not the threat to his own safety, he'd accepted that risk when he'd volunteered. What bothered him was the idea that his death might make things worse for Princess Lyrishan. "Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" When you joined the Corps, what made you willing to die for other Marines? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't dying for them that mattered. It was living with myself afterward if I didn't try. He met Marcus's eyes. Whatever you're thinking about doing, just remember, sometimes the best way to help someone is to survive long enough to be useful. The next morning, Marcus escorted Princess Lyrishan to Interrogation Bay 7. The chamber was stark and functional, with restraint devices that could accommodate a dozen different species. Waiting for them were Admiral Vexar, his intelligence chief Commander Zexthal, and a device that Marcus recognized from intelligence reports as a neural probe. Sergeant Chen, you will observe only, Admiral Vexar commanded. Any interference will result in your immediate execution. Understood, sir. They strapped Princess Lyrishan into the examination chair with casual efficiency. Her deteriorating condition was obvious even to Zephyrian eyes. Her movements were sluggish, her skin had an unhealthy pallor, and she seemed to be having trouble focusing. Princess, Commander Zexthal began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd conducted hundreds of these sessions. We require information regarding Confederation military assets, defense protocols, and the location of your government's evacuation sites. I have been isolated from strategic planning for several months, she replied quietly. My value to the Confederation was primarily ceremonial. I know nothing that would be useful to you. It was probably true. Marcus had spent enough time studying the briefing materials to know that Princess Lyrishan had been effectively exiled from the Confederation's inner circle after advocating for peace negotiations with the Empire. Her own people had considered her a liability long before they'd abandoned her. Commander Zexthal wasn't interested in probability. We shall determine the value of your knowledge ourselves. Activate the neural probe. Marcus watched helplessly as they attached the device to the princess's head. The neural probe was designed to extract information directly from a subject's memory centers, but it was notoriously imprecise and often caused permanent brain damage. For someone in Princess Lyrishan's deteriorating condition, it was essentially a death sentence. The machine hummed to life, and Princess Lyrishan's body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the swirling star fields, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. On the monitoring display, her vital signs spiked into dangerous territory. Commander, Marcus said carefully, her medical readings indicate severe stress. Should we pause the procedure? The subject's comfort is irrelevant, Sergeant. We will extract what we require. For 20 minutes, Marcus stood and watched as the neural probe tore through Princess Lyrishan's memories. The machine pulled up images on its display screen, scenes from her childhood in crystal palaces, diplomatic meetings with alien dignitaries, and, finally, the last desperate days as the Confederation government prepared to abandon their capital. Most of it was exactly what she'd said: ceremonial duties and diplomatic functions. There were no military secrets, no hidden bases, no strategic information that would be useful to the Empire. Just the memories of someone who'd spent her life trying to build bridges between worlds that wanted to destroy each other. When they finally shut down the neural probe, Princess Lyrishan was unconscious and her vital signs were barely detectable. The medical scanner showed significant neurological damage and accelerated cellular breakdown. Disappointing, Admiral Vexar commented, reviewing the extracted data. The subject appears to have been truthful about her limited knowledge. Dispose of her. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it stated so casually made his blood run cold. Around the interrogation chamber, the Zephyrian officers were already turning their attention to other matters, treating the princess's death sentence as just another administrative detail. Sir, Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled, what about the prisoner's intelligence value? There may be additional information we could extract with different techniques. Admiral Vexar fixed all four eyes on Marcus with obvious irritation. Sergeant Chen, the subject is dying regardless of our actions. Her biochemical deterioration will render her unconscious within days and dead within a week. We have extracted what limited value she possessed. Further resources expenditure is unjustifiable. Request permission to maintain guard duty until the prisoner expires naturally, sir. For security purposes. It was a desperate gambit, but Marcus was counting on the Admiral's bureaucratic mindset. Imperial regulations were clear about prisoner handling procedures, and, technically Princess Narration was still classified as a high-value asset until officially declared worthless. Commander Zexthal's mandibles clicked with annoyance. Admiral, the human appears to be developing inappropriate attachment to the prisoner. Perhaps reassignment would be advisable. Sergeant Chen, Admiral Vexar said slowly, explain your continued interest in this assignment. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would determine whether he lived through the next 5 minutes. Sir, in my experience, dying prisoners sometimes experience moments of clarity before death. Terminal lucidity can produce unexpected intelligence revelations. Maintaining observation ensures we don't miss potential last-minute information. It was complete nonsense, but it was the kind of nonsense that sounded reasonable to intelligence officers who'd spent their careers looking for hidden meanings in everything. Admiral Vexar considered the explanation for several long seconds before nodding slowly. Very well. You will continue prisoner observation until subject expires. However, any deviation from standard protocols will result in summary execution. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. As they transported Princess Narration back to her cell, Marcus wondered what the hell he was going to do with the time he'd just bought. She was still dying, still beyond the reach of any medical intervention the ship could provide, and still completely alone except for one human soldier who was rapidly running out of ideas. But, as they secured her back on the sleeping platform, Princess Narration opened her eyes and looked directly at him. For just a moment, her stellar gaze was completely focused and aware. Thank you, she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Marcus nodded once, then stepped back into the corridor and sealed the cell door behind him. Outside, the ship continued its journey toward the next system, carrying its crew toward battles that would determine the fate of civilizations. But, in Detention Cell 7, something had changed. A human soldier had decided that some things were worth protecting even when protecting them was impossible. And, somewhere in the space between duty and compassion, between orders and conscience, Marcus Chen began to understand why his species was considered either the galaxy's greatest hope or its most dangerous threat. The next few days would test exactly which one they were. Marcus spent the next 48 hours learning everything he could about Xerian biology, biochemistry, and medical technology. The ship's database was extensive, but most of the information was classified at levels far above his security clearance. He was making little progress through official channels when an unexpected ally appeared. Sergeant Chun? The voice belonged to Dr. Kellox, one of the ship's medical officers. The Altarian stood barely 4 feet tall, with gray skin and enormous black eyes that seemed to see everything. I understand you have questions about xenobiology. Marcus looked up from the medical terminal he'd been struggling with for the past 3 hours. Doctor. I'm researching treatment options for metabolic disorders in Xerian physiology. Ah. For academic purposes, I assume? Dr. Kellox's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were knowing. Of course. The doctor settled into a chair beside Marcus, his small hands dancing over the terminal controls with surprising speed. Interesting coincidence. I have been conducting my own research into Xerian biochemistry. Purely for educational purposes, you understand. The data that appeared on the screen was far more detailed than anything Marcus had been able to access. Molecular structures, metabolic pathways, and detailed analysis of the genetic modifications that had been introduced to the Xerian royal bloodline over centuries of selective breeding. This modification, Dr. Kellox explained, pointing to a complex protein diagram, allows Xerian nobility to interface directly with their crystalline technology. However, it also creates a dependency on specific trace minerals and biochemical compounds that must be regularly replenished. Marcus studied the data carefully. What happens if the supply is interrupted? Cellular breakdown, organ failure, and death within 7 to 10 days. The condition is essentially irreversible without access to the specific compounds produced by Xerian bioprocessors. Dr. Kellox paused, then added quietly, there are no known substitutes. Marcus felt his last hope crumbling. No alternatives at all? Well, the doctor said slowly, there is one theoretical possibility. The required compounds could potentially be synthesized using advanced bioprocessors, but the Empire possesses no such technology. The devices are unique to Xerian civilization and closely guarded by their government. What about captured equipment? Dr. Kellogg's brought up another display showing the inventory from their recent assault on the Crystal Palace. The bioprocessors we recovered were damaged during the attack. Repair would require intimate knowledge of Xerian biotechnology, resources we do not possess, and... He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. The active participation of someone with the genetic modifications necessary to interface with the systems. Understanding dawned slowly. Princess Lyrishan could repair the devices herself. Theoretically, yes. But such an action would require her to actively cooperate with her captors, essentially betraying her own people's most closely guarded secrets. The psychological barriers alone would be insurmountable for most individuals. Marcus sat back in his chair, processing the implications. The equipment they needed was sitting in the ship's storage bays, but it was useless without someone who could activate it. And the only person who could activate it was the same person who would rather die than help the empire that had destroyed her home. Doctor, he said carefully, hypothetically speaking, what would happen if someone attempted to repair this equipment without authorization? Hypothetically? Charges of tampering with captured assets, violation of security protocols, and, possibly treason. The penalties would be severe. Dr. Kellogg's expression was completely serious. Of course, if such an attempt were to succeed, it might be viewed differently by higher command. Results, as they say, justify methods. That evening, Marcus stood outside Princess Lyrishan's cell, trying to figure out how to broach the subject of cooperation with someone who had every reason to hate him and everything he represented. She was visibly weaker than she'd been the day before, her movements slower and her breathing more labored. Princess, he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you answer. She looked up from her meditation, her stellar eyes dim but still aware. I am listening, Sergeant Chen. Marcus took a deep breath and laid out everything: Dr. Kellogg's research, the captured bioprocessors, and the theoretical possibility of synthesizing the compounds she needed to survive. He was careful to explain the risks, both to himself and to her, if they attempted such a plan. When he finished, Princess Lyrishan was silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke. You are asking me to betray the most sacred secrets of my people to save my own life. I'm asking you to stay alive long enough to decide what your life is worth. And, if I refuse? If I choose to die rather than compromise my people's security? Marcus met her eyes steadily. Then, I'll stay here with you until the end. Nobody should die alone. Again, silence stretched between them. Outside in the corridor, Marcus could hear the normal sounds of ship operations, crew members moving to their duty stations, the hum of air recyclers, the distant thrum of engines carrying them through hyperspace. Sergeant Chen, Princess Lyrishan said eventually, why does my survival matter to you? Your people gain nothing from my continued existence. In fact, associating with me places you in considerable danger. It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had been asking himself since this whole situation began. I've been thinking about that, he said. Back on Earth, we had a concept called the thin blue line, the idea that civilization is protected by people willing to stand between order and chaos. But we learned something during our expansion to the stars. He leaned against the cell door, choosing his words carefully. The line isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing to protect what's worth protecting, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You didn't choose to be abandoned by your people, and you didn't choose to be captured by mine. But I can choose whether to abandon you too. Princess Lyrishan considered this for several minutes. The bioprocessors contain information that could be used to create weapons of mass destruction. If I help repair them, I could be providing the Empire with the means to destroy other worlds. Or, Marcus countered, you could be staying alive long enough to make sure that doesn't happen. Dead princesses don't get to influence how their technology is used. It was a calculated risk, appealing to her sense of responsibility rather than her desire for survival. Marcus had read her psychological profile from the intelligence files. Princess Lyrishan was someone who'd spent her life trying to protect others, even when it cost her everything. There would need to be conditions, she said finally. Safeguards to ensure the technology cannot be weaponized. What kind of safeguards? The bioprocessors can be programmed with specific limitations. I could configure them to produce only medical compounds, with automatic shutdown protocols if anyone attempts to modify them for other purposes. Her stellar eyes seemed to brighten slightly. It would require me to remain alive to maintain the programming, of course. Marcus felt hope stirring in his chest. You're saying you'll do it? I am saying that if someone were to provide access to the captured equipment, and if that someone were willing to accept the considerable risks involved, I might be persuaded to assist in a purely humanitarian application of my people's technology. She paused, then added with what might have been humor, for the sake of galactic peace and understanding, naturally. Naturally. The plan they developed over the next several hours was insanely risky and probably suicidal. Marcus would need to access Storage Bay 12 during the night shift, when minimal crew were on duty. He'd have to disable security protocols, transport Princess Narration to the storage area without being detected, and then hope she could repair the bioprocessors quickly enough that they could return her to her cell before the morning watch began. If they were caught, Marcus would face a firing squad and Princess Narration would probably be executed immediately. If they succeeded, she would live, but they'd both be walking a tightrope between survival and discovery for the rest of the deployment. Are you certain about this, Sergeant Chen? Princess Narration asked as Marcus prepared to begin the operation. Once we start, there will be no turning back. Marcus thought about all the reasons he should abandon this plan: his career, his life, the safety of his fellow humans aboard the ship. Then, he thought about watching Princess Narration die alone in a cell while everyone around her pretended not to care. Princess, he said, my people have a saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. I figure if I'm going to be good people, I better act like it. The storage bay was dimly lit and filled with equipment salvaged from their assault on the Crystal Palace. Marcus had studied the bay's layout during his off-duty hours, memorizing the location of security sensors and escape routes. Getting Princess Narration past the guards had required creative use of maintenance tunnels and a great deal of luck. The bioprocessors were exactly where Dr. Kellogg's had said they would be: 3 crystalline devices roughly the size of human torsos, their surfaces dark and apparently lifeless. According to the inventory reports, they'd been damaged during the palace assault when Imperial troops had used explosive charges to breach the medical facility. Princess Narration approached the devices with something approaching reverence. Her hands moved over their surfaces with practiced familiarity, and gradually the crystals began to emit a soft, pulsing light. The damage is extensive but reparable, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. However, the repair process will require several hours of continuous interface. I will be vulnerable during this time. I'll watch your back, Marcus promised. Take as long as you need. What followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed. Princess Narration placed her hands on the central bioprocessor and her entire body began to glow with the same soft light. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the swirling star fields, and her breathing became deep and rhythmic. Around her, the bioprocessors awakened. Light flowed through crystalline channels like liquid fire, and Marcus could hear a sound like distant singing emanating from the devices. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy, and he found himself holding his breath as if afraid to disturb some sacred ritual. Hours passed. Marcus kept watch, monitoring the security feeds and listening for any signs that their absence had been discovered. Around him, the bioprocessors continued their work, rebuilding themselves according to programming that had been encoded into Princess Naration's very DNA. Finally, as the ship's night cycle was drawing to a close, the light began to fade. Princess Narration opened her eyes, and Marcus was startled to see that they looked brighter, more focused than they had since her capture. It is done, she said simply. The bioprocessors are functional and programmed according to our agreement. They will produce the compounds necessary to sustain my life, but they cannot be modified for any other purpose. Marcus looked at the devices, which now hummed quietly with their own internal energy. How long before they start producing what you need? The first batch should be ready within the hour. After that, they will produce a continuous supply as long as they remain powered and undisturbed. She met his eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sergeant Chen, you have saved my life. I will not forget this debt. Princess, Marcus said as they prepared to return to the detention level. Where I come from, we don't keep score on things like this. You were in trouble, I could help, so I did. That's just what humans do. As they made their way back through the maintenance tunnels, Marcus wondered if that was really true. Were humans really any different from other species, or was he just telling himself a comforting story about his own people's nobility? The answer, he suspected, would depend on what happened next. Because their real test wasn't whether they could save one life, it was whether they could do it without losing their souls in the process. 3 weeks after the bioprocessor incident, everything changed. Marcus had been living on borrowed time, knowing that eventually someone would notice the unauthorized repairs to the captured Xerian equipment. He prepared cover stories, backup plans, and contingency protocols for when the inevitable investigation began. What he hadn't prepared for was the fleet's emergency jump to the Corellan system, where the 47th Expedition found itself facing the largest rebel fleet anyone had seen in decades. All hands to battle stations, Admiral Vexhar's voice echoed throughout the decimator as Marcus watched the tactical displays from his position outside Princess Lyration's cell. Enemy contact bearing 27 Mark IV. Multiple capital ships detected. Through the ship's viewport, Marcus could see the rebel fleet deploying in a formation that spoke of professional military planning. These weren't desperate pirates or poorly equipped insurgents, this was a coordinated force with advanced ships and tactical doctrine that matched anything the Empire could field. Impressive, Princess Lyration observed from her cell, where she'd been watching the same displays. Her health had stabilized dramatically since the bioprocessors came online, and her stellar eyes now carried their full brightness. The Confederation appears to have found new allies. Marcus turned to study her expression. You know something about this? Before my political exile, I was aware of diplomatic overtures between the Confederation and several independent systems. It appears those negotiations were more successful than anyone anticipated. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the undertone of satisfaction. The first engagement began 20 minutes later. Marcus watched through security feeds as Imperial fighters clashed with rebel interceptors in a deadly dance among the gas giants' moons. The rebels were holding their own, giving better than they got, and their capital ships were demonstrating tactics that hadn't appeared in any Imperial intelligence briefings. Sergeant Chen, report to Admiral Vexhar immediately, the ship's communication system announced. Marcus felt his stomach drop. After 3 weeks of careful routine, something had finally attracted command attention. He found Admiral Vexhar in the Combat Information Center, surrounded by tactical displays showing a battle that was not going according to plan. The Admiral's compound eyes tracked multiple threats simultaneously while his prosthetic arms manipulated holographic controls with precise efficiency. Sergeant Chen, the Admiral said without looking away from his displays, I am told you have developed familiarity with our Xerian prisoner's psychology. I require your assessment of her likely responses to interrogation regarding enemy fleet dispositions. It took Marcus a moment to process the request. Admiral Vexhar wanted to interrogate Princess Lyration about the rebel fleet's capabilities. Under normal circumstances, it would be a reasonable tactical decision. Under current circumstances, it was a death sentence not just for the princess, but potentially for everyone aboard the ship. Sir, the prisoner has been isolated from Confederation military planning for months. Her knowledge of current operational parameters would be limited. Nevertheless, any intelligence regarding enemy capabilities could prove valuable. Prepare her for immediate interrogation. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. If they subjected Princess Lyration to another neural probe session, they might discover her recent medical treatment. That would lead to questions about the bioprocessors, which would lead to his arrest and execution. But refusing a direct order during combat operations would have the same result. Admiral, he said carefully, request permission to conduct preliminary questioning myself. The prisoner has demonstrated increased cooperation with familiar interrogators. A gradual approach might yield better results than immediate intensive techniques. Admiral Vexhar's attention snapped to Marcus with all 4 eyes. Around the CIC, other officers paused their activities to listen. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before the Admiral spoke. You have 15 minutes, Sergeant. After that, we proceed with standard interrogation protocols regardless of her condition. As Marcus made his way back to the detention level, he could feel the ship shuddering under enemy fire. Through the corridors, crew members ran to emergency stations while damage control teams rushed to contain breaches in the outer hull. The 47th expedition was fighting for its life, and he was about to ask Princess Narration to help save the people who'd captured her. She was waiting when he reached her cell, her posture alert and her expression unreadable. "The battle is not proceeding as your admiral expected," she observed. "Princess, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that both our lives depend on your answer." Marcus leaned against the cell door, choosing his words with extreme care. "Admiral Vexar wants to interrogate you about the rebel fleet's capabilities. He's planning to use neural probe techniques that will discover recent changes in your medical status." Understanding flickered in her stellar eyes. "Ah. And such a discovery would raise uncomfortable questions about unauthorized repair activities. Among other things." Marcus took a deep breath. "I can buy us some time by conducting the preliminary questioning myself, but eventually they're going to want answers. Real answers about what the Confederation fleet is capable of." Princess Narration moved to the cell's small viewport, watching the distant flashes of weapon fire against the starfield. "Sergeant Chen, you have already risked everything to preserve my life. I will not ask you to compound that risk by refusing a direct order from your superior. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you to help me figure out how to keep us both alive. And I am telling you that I understand the situation completely." She turned from the viewport to face him directly. "The question is not whether I will cooperate with the interrogation. The question is whether you are prepared for the consequences of what that cooperation might reveal." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the ship's communication system crackled to life with an urgent announcement from the bridge. "All senior staff to combat stations. Enemy fleet is deploying unknown weapons technology. Repeat, unknown weapons technology." Through the cell's viewport, Marcus could see new lights appearing among the rebel ship's brilliant pulses of energy that seemed to tear holes in space itself. As he watched, one of the Imperial destroyers simply vanished, consumed by a sphere of absolute darkness that expanded and contracted like a living thing. "Dear God," he whispered. "What is that?" "Zirian quantum disruptors," Princess Narration said quietly. "Weapons technology that the Confederation was not supposed to possess. It appears my people's allies have been more generous than anyone anticipated." Marcus stared at her, realization dawning slowly. "You knew this was coming." "I suspected. The diplomatic initiatives I was aware of involved more than simple military alliances. There were discussions of technology exchange, shared research programs, and mutual defense agreements that would pool the resources of multiple civilizations." Her expression was completely calm. "The Empire has spent centuries conquering individual systems. Now it faces something it has never encountered before, a true coalition." The implications were staggering. If the rebel fleet had access to advanced weapons from multiple civilizations, the Imperial expansion could not only be stopped but potentially reversed. Entire sectors that had been under Imperial control for generations might throw off their chains. "Princess," Marcus said slowly, "what exactly did you agree to when you repaired those bioprocessors?" Her stellar eyes seemed to sparkle with something that might have been amusement. "I agreed to configure them for medical applications only. I did not agree to refrain from other activities during the repair process." Understanding hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You sent a message. Through the quantum substrate of the crystalline matrix. You told them where we were." "I informed the Confederation of the 47th Expedition's location, disposition, and tactical capabilities. Information that was readily available to someone with my security clearances, even in exile." Princess Naration's voice carried no trace of apology. "You asked me to stay alive long enough to decide what my life was worth, Sergeant Chen. This is my decision." The ship shuddered again as more quantum disruptors found their mark. Through the security feeds, Marcus could see Imperial ships beginning to fall back in disorder, their formation crumbling under weapons they had no defense against. "You used me," he said, his voice hollow. You let me risk everything to save you, and you used that trust to set up an ambush. Yes. The simple honesty of her admission was somehow worse than any justification would have been. Marcus had genuinely believed that he was saving an innocent life, that his actions represented the best of human nature. Instead, he'd been a pawn in a military operation that was now killing thousands of Imperial personnel. However, Princess Narration continued, I want you to understand something important. My transmission was sent before the bioprocessors were activated. My life was still hanging by a thread when I chose to trust you with information that could destroy both of us. Marcus looked up, meeting her stellar gaze. What are you saying? I am saying that you saved my life before I decided to save yours. When I sent that transmission, I had no guarantee that you would succeed in repairing the bioprocessors. I could have died before the Confederation fleet arrived, taking my secrets with me. Her voice softened slightly. But, you risked everything for someone you barely knew, asking nothing in return. That is not a commodity that exists anywhere else in this galaxy, Sergeant Chen. The ship's intercom crackled with Admiral Vexhar's voice, edged with desperation. All hands, prepare for emergency jump to hyperspace. Repeat, emergency jump procedures in effect. Through the viewport, Marcus could see the Imperial fleet beginning its retreat. Ships that had seemed invincible a few hours ago were now running for their lives, pursued by weapons that turned the void itself into a weapon. The Admiral will order my immediate execution when he realizes what has happened, Princess Narration said calmly. He will also order yours, regardless of whether you were aware of my actions. Imperial doctrine does not allow for innocent bystanders in situations involving treason. Marcus felt the familiar weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. He could report Princess Naration's confession and hope that cooperation might save his life. He could remain silent and hope that their secret died with them both. Or he could find a third option that might save everyone. Princess, he said finally, there's something I need to tell you about humans. We're really bad at accepting impossible situations. The jump to hyperspace came just as the first quantum disruptor reached the decimator's position. The ship twisted through dimensions, escaping into the safety of faster-than-light travel while its crew tried to process what they just witnessed. In Detention Cell 7, a human soldier and an alien princess sat in silence, both knowing that the next few hours would determine not just their own fates, but possibly the future of the war itself. The turning point had come, not through grand strategy or superior weapons, but through a simple choice to care about someone who had been abandoned by everyone else. Now they would all learn whether the choice had saved the galaxy or doomed it. Outside their cell, the stars wheeled past in hyperspace, carrying them toward a destination none of them could predict. But, whatever came next, Marcus Chen knew one thing for certain: he would not abandon Princess Narration now. Even if that meant standing against an entire empire. After all, that's what humans did. They protected their family, even when their family was an alien princess who had just turned the war upside down. The consequences would be what they were. But, the choice had already been made.